Shalom, dear Holocaust survivors, Your Excellencies, dear patrons, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, guten Abend, bonsoir. Thank you all for being with us. We extend our special appreciation to all of you who contributed to this event. My name is Ariel Rosenstein. I serve as Deputy Ambassador of Israel to Switzerland, and together with my colleague Ms. Emilia Karkabasi, Deputy Ambassador of Grace to Switzerland, we are honored to welcome you all to this year's International Holocaust Remembrance Ceremony in Bern. Due to COVID, and to ensure the safety of the audience in these challenging times, we have decided to broadcast our ceremony live online from the UPU here in Bern. We ask that you keep your masks on, except when speaking on stage. The ceremony is being translated into French, German, and English. For the audience in the UPU, the different channels are indicated over here. At home, at the top of the page on the right side, you can change the language as you prefer. This year's memorial program, chaired by the Greek Embassy, carries the title, Teaching and Learning About the Holocaust, the Example of Thessaloniki, a Jewish metropolis, its glory and its destruction. Before we begin, I would like to invite you all to stand as we hold a minute of silence to honor the memory of the victims of the Shoah. Thank you. You can be seated. We begin with a prayer remembering the victims of the Shoah, El Malach Chamim, read by Rabbi Michael Cohn of the Jewish community of Bern.
אל מלא רחמים, דיין אלמנות ואבי יתומים, אל נא תחשב ותתאפק לדם ישראל, שנשפך כמים. המצא מנוחה נכונה על כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מאירים ומזהירים, לנשמותיהם של רבבות אלפי ישראל, אנשים ונשים, ילדים וילדות, שנהרגו ונשחטו ונשרפו ונחנקו ונקברו חיים, בארצות אשר נגע בהן יד הצורר הגרמני וגרוריו, כולם קדושים וטהורים, ובהם גאונים וצדיקים, ארזי הלבנון אדירי התורה, בגן עדן תהא מנוחתם. לכן בעל הרחמים יסתירם בסתר כנפיו לעולמים, ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתם, אדוני הוא נחלתם, ואנוכו בשלום על משכבם, ונאמר אמן.
Thank you, Rabbi Cohn. The first speaker of this evening will be the Ambassador of the State of Israel, Her Excellency Ms. Yifat Reshef.
Dear Holocaust survivors, dear Ms. Kalin, President of the National Assembly, dear Dr. Levin, dear Rabbi Cohn, dear Excellencies and members of the Diplomatic Corps, Swiss government officials, representatives of Jewish communities, dear patrons, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen. I am both honored and humbled to speak before you at this important ceremony as Israel's new ambassador to Switzerland. Unfortunately, it is already the second time that we have to broadcast this remembrance event and ask participants and guests to join us virtually due to the pandemic. We may be far away from you physically, but in spirit, we are together. The essence of this International Remembrance Day is to honor the memory of Holocaust victims and to educate the young generation about Holocaust history and lessons so as to ensure such atrocities will never happen again. Today, we will focus on the experience of our brothers and sisters from the Jewish community of Greece during World War II, but also, as always, honor the Swiss Holocaust survivors, share their stories and memories, and give tribute to those who are no longer among us. I would like to welcome warmly and greet especially Holocaust survivors Bronislav Ehrlich, Betty Brenner, and Mark Warszawski, who will gift us later with his cello playing. Thank you so much for being with us today, dear Mr. Ehrlich, dear Ms. Brenner, and dear Mr. Warszawski. Furthermore, later we will have the honor of hearing a testimony of the Greek Holocaust survivor Janet Hetzis, kindly recorded by the Gamaral Foundation. Sadly, Professor Ladislav Loeb, the speaker of last year's commemoration event, passed away on October 2nd, 2021. We can never thank him enough for his precious work. Ladislav Loeb worked tirelessly until the end to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive, to draw lessons from the past for the present, in school classes and with countless lectures and interviews. When it comes to fighting Holocaust denial and distortion, to fight anti-Semitism, to help Holocaust survivors and to educate future generations, Israel, its government, its diplomats and its entire society pledge to continue with our tireless efforts. I am happy to mention in this regard the new important resolution which has been adopted by consensus last week by the United Nations General Assembly. This new resolution, initiated by my colleagues from our mission to the UN, led by Israel and Germany, and co-sponsored by Switzerland and other countries represented here today, is intended to give countries practical tools to fight against the various expressions of Holocaust denial. I would also like to put emphasis on the important work done in Switzerland by the Swiss Federation of Jewish Communities, as well as the various organizations, including, for example, GRA, CICAD, the Association of Swiss Jewish Refugee Aid and Welfare Organization, and other important bodies like the Gamaral Foundation. It is essential to carefully preserve all the precious recording and testimonies of Holocaust survivors and make them accessible to everyone, in particular to teacher and school classes. We must also encourage initiatives in that matter, like the realization of exhibitions, conferences, books, films, or theater pieces. Moreover, beyond honoring the memory of Holocaust victims, we all have the duty to make our world a better and safer place. People should respect one another, extend a helping hand in times of need, and face joint challenges and threats together so that we can all live in peace and security. I would like to thank everyone who contributed to this important evening, and especially my deputy, Ariel Rosenstein, and our wonderful team who led the effort of organizing this ceremony together with our colleagues from the Greek Embassy and other IRA partners, and of course, the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. I want to thank all of you who honored us today with your presence and wish us all a very meaningful evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Reshef, and good evening from me as well. I invite to the podium the Chargée d'Affaires of the Embassy of the United States of America, Ms. Eva Weigel-Schultz.
Good evening, President Kalin, President Levin, Rabbi Cohen, Ambassador Reshef, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Holocaust survivors. It is a great personal privilege for me to be here again this year to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Ambassador Scott Miller wanted to be here as well, but unfortunately was delayed in his return to Switzerland from the United States, but he sends his very best regards and looks forward to continuing this important collaboration with all of you. Each year at this time, we come together to honor the 6 million victims murdered in the Holocaust and to share the courageous stories of those who survived. Remembering the victims and celebrating the survivors is part of our moral responsibility to never forget. Unfortunately, the shocking attack and hostage-taking at a synagogue in my own country in recent days, in the state of Texas, exposes the reality that Jewish communities and institutions continue to be the target of terror attacks and conspiracy theories worldwide. This is a painful reminder that we cannot let up on our work to confront anti-Semitism in every country at every time. We must accept the continued responsibility to work together to counter Holocaust denial and distortion, which erodes our understanding of the historical truth and allows for anti-Semitism to inch dangerously towards the mainstream. For the Biden administration, this commitment is deeply personal. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is the stepson of Holocaust survivor Samuel Pizar, who survived 4 years in Auschwitz, Dachau, and other concentration camps as a youth. He was the only one out of the 900 children at his school in Poland who survived the Holocaust. Not only did he survive, he went on to become a celebrated and accomplished legal and foreign policy advisor, co-founder of Yad Vashem France, and an activist dedicated to the cause of peace and human dignity. His story is a compelling example of how survivors of the worst atrocity in modern history have contributed to the betterment of humanity. And Mr. Blinken speaks often and eloquently about how powerfully his stepfather's extraordinary legacy has shaped his own commitment to combating anti-Semitism. To expand our efforts in that regard, Mr. Blinken recently appointed Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt, a well-known and respected leader in this field, as his special advisor on Holocaust issues. And this appointment will supplement and expand our existing work with our special envoy on Holocaust issues to increase our advocacy and outreach. Remembering and educating about the victims, the heroes, and lessons of the Holocaust is ever more important today as Holocaust deniers and minimizers grow louder in public discourse and the survivor generation dwindles with age. In the words of President Biden, we must pass the history of the Holocaust to our grandchildren and their grandchildren in order to keep real the promise of never again. His commitment to vigilance and support of human rights is a cornerstone of our administration's overall foreign policy, including initiatives such as the Summit for Democracy, which President Biden hosted in December, which is a call to action for all countries to take concrete steps to protect freedom and human rights, both at home and abroad. We were pleased to work with Switzerland and Israel, along with many other partners here today, on this important initiative to safeguard against any return to the horrors of history. May today's somber event and the legacy of the Holocaust encourage us all to stand up for human dignity, condemn anti-Semitism, and recommit to tolerance and freedom worldwide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Weigel-Schultz. I now invite the Ambassador of Germany, His Excellency Michael Flügger, to the podium.
Sehr verehrte Holocaust-Überlebende und
Dear Holocaust survivors and families, dear President Levin, dear Rabbi Cohn, Excellencies, dear participants at the screens, ladies and gentlemen. Today, on this 27th January, we come together on the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, also here in Bern, on the screen to remember the extermination of millions of people, Jews, Sinti, Roma, disabled people, and people with different political views by the National Socialists. Even though the pandemic is forcing us once again this year to forego the usual framework for meeting and we can only come together here virtually, it is of great concern to us to mark the Holocaust Remembrance Day with you. We hope thus to send out a signal that we will continue to stand together. Even in these unsettled times, we stand up for the Holocaust survivors. We stand up for our common values. In February 2021, Germany handed over the IHRA chairmanship to Greece. I am honored that you, dear Mrs. Hadis, will share your memories as a survivor with us today. I will also follow with great interest your presentation, Mr. Schaltiel, to learn more about this year's theme, namely teaching and learning about the Holocaust, the example of Thessaloniki, a Jewish metropolis, its glory and destruction. It is an often repeated phrase, we can only learn from history if we cherish memory, because only by doing so can we give the deceased and survivors back their dignity. We want to remember the deceased and listen to the survivors in order to keep their story alive. The German President Steinmeier yesterday went to the former concentration camp Sachsenhausen and said, there is no right to forget. Much more, it's the victims who have a right to be remembered. But the responsibility is not over just by remembering, but we need to always stand up actively against racism and anti-Semitism. And this is the leitmotif for the new German government, that we want to learn from that terrible German history, and we have such an indelible responsibility that arises from the German history. Germany will continue its commitment for a world that remembers the Holocaust, for a world without genocide. The new German government has unequivocally declared that it will continue to oppose discrimination against people on the basis of their religion or other characteristics and to resolutely oppose crimes against humanity. Today, we not only commemorate the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp, the immeasurable suffering that Nazi Germany brought upon the Jews began years earlier. The decision for the industrial murder of the Jews in Europe was taken on the 20th of January 1942 at the infamous Wannsee Conference. The new German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock said on the occasion of the 80th anniversary of the Wannsee Conference, I quote, Today we remember the murdered Jewish women, men and children and those who survived the Holocaust. We will never forget what Germany did to them. Officials of the Federal Foreign Office who placed themselves at the service of crimes and genocide of the Nazi regime are also guilty of their suffering. They thus became compliant helpers and abettors of injustice. This chapter of history must be an incitement to us. Never again something like this is allowed to happen. We are very concerned about the dramatic increase in cases of Holocaust denial. The German ambassador to Israel and the Israeli ambassador to Germany denounced the ongoing Holocaust denial as a social and international phenomenon in January 2022 and said it's a phenomenon in an ongoing way. And against this background, like has just been said, Israel and Germany together on the 20th January will think of the 80th anniversary of the Wannsee Conference. Israel and Germany jointly introduced a declaration on Holocaust denial in the UN General Assembly. Based on IHRA's definition of the term Holocaust, the resolution contains for the first time a definition of Holocaust denial. Further, the resolution calls on all member states and social media in particular to proactively address the problem and further develop the fight against Holocaust denial. We thank all the states that supported us through their co-sponsorship, including our host state here, Switzerland, so that the resolution could be adopted by consensus. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to conclude by remembering our guest of honor last year, Professor Ladislaus Loeb. We are grateful that Professor Loeb, as one of the last survivors of the Holocaust in Switzerland, was able to share his memories with us just last year. Ladislaus Loeb passed away last October. We will honor his memory. We feel closely connected to Holocaust survivors in Switzerland and around the world and will preserve their memories and remembrance of the Holocaust for future generations. Thank you.
Let us welcome the distinguished President of the Swiss National Council, Ms. Irene Kellen, to speak. I invite you to the podium.
Dear Mr. Warszawski, dear Holocaust survivors, dear Rabbi Cohen, dear Dr. Levin, dear Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Today we mourn the 6 million Jewish children, women and men. We mourn the millions of Sinti and Roma, people with disabilities, homosexual men and women, Jehovah's Witnesses, Afro-Germans, political activists and prisoners of war who were killed in the name of the Nazi ideology. We also mourn the thousands of Jewish women, men and children who sought protection in Switzerland but whom we abandoned. Today, 77 years ago, Soviet troops advanced on Auschwitz in Poland. The liberation of the concentration camp was not in their orders. They knew nothing about it. When they reached the camp in the early afternoon on 27th January, the place seemed quiet and deserted at first. Only gradually did the soldiers realize that they were surrounded by people. They met 7,500 survivors marked by exhaustion, hunger and freezing cold. After 5 years of hell in Auschwitz, they were finally free, but many did not survive.
Auschwitz alone, making it the largest mass murder in a single location in human history. This shall never happen again. However, I agree with the late UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, on occasions such as this, rhetoric comes easily. We rightly say never again, but action is much harder. Since the Holocaust, the world has, to its shame, failed more than once to prevent or halt genocide. It is therefore important that on this day we do not only commemorate numbers and dates, but that we remember how it happened and why. We must remind ourselves again and again that it is not the indescribable or unimaginable that led to the Holocaust, but a multitude of events that took place over several years in a variety of European settings. That the Holocaust, this crime against humanity, was not committed by savages and beasts, but by fellow human beings. That the Holocaust was fueled by hatred, but it was allowed to spread through indifference. This passive complicity can only be fought by a collective conscience. However, a collective conscience does not evolve on its own. It grows through our personal relationship with the victims and the survivors. So on this day, we also want to honor the survivors of the Holocaust. It is with great respect and humility that we admire their courage, resilience, and perseverance to carry on, despite the heavy burden of painful memories and deprivations. Over the decades, they have relived their trauma again and again by sharing with us what happened, telling us so we can learn from their experience and do better. But 77 years is a lifetime. What will happen to the collective memory when we are left to our own devices? When the survivors are no longer among us to keep those memories alive? Frankly, I'm dreading that moment, because sometimes it would be easier to forget than to remember. But we have to remember. Et je suis certaine d'une chose, et cela me réconforte.
But I'm certain of one thing, and it gives me comfort. Each of us can do a great deal to keep these memories in the collective consciousness and to ensure that this consciousness makes us vigilant interpreters of the present. This is one of the reasons why our parliament accepted a motion at the end of last year to create an official memorial in Switzerland for the victims of National Socialism, a memorial for those persecuted, disenfranchised and murdered, a memorial for the Jewish people, minorities, dissidents as well as refugees turned away at the border of Switzerland. The memorial will also honor those who offered help to those persecuted in Switzerland. Future generations need to know what happened and what racism and discrimination can lead to, so that they realize how fragile and precious democracy and the rule of law are. Then they can say never again and make sure it never happens again. Thank you for your attention.
Very much, President Kalin. The President of the Swiss Confederation, Mr. Ignazio Cassis, will be sharing with us a pre-recorded message.
Wir erinnern uns, weil wir nicht.
We remember because we do not want to forget. Because we must not forget. Remembering helps to understand. It helps to learn from history. That is why every year on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, we remember the 6 million Jewish men, women and children killed and all the other victims of the Holocaust. Today, it is 77 years to the day since the Red Army liberated the Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination camp on the 27th January 1945. The prisoners of Buchenwald concentration camp had to hold out for 11 more weeks. One of them, Fischl Rabinovich. I had the great honor of meeting this wonderful man in person a few days ago in the Ticino. Fischl Rabinovich is 97 years old and one of the last Holocaust survivors in Switzerland. born in Poland in 1924, he was deported in 1941 and spent almost 4 years in various labor and concentration camps. His parents and 7 of his 9 siblings do not survive the Holocaust. Rabinovich himself does not even weigh 30 kilograms when he is liberated, but he lives. In 1947, he came to Switzerland as a young man. After a stay in the Davos Sanatorium, he does an apprenticeship, marries and moves to Ticino. Always a talented painter, Rabinovich began to process what he had experienced into pictures after his retirement. My paintings should help us to never forget what happened back then, is how he explains his passion. 50 works of art have been created over the years, an impressive visual examination of Judaism and the Shoah. Seeing these pictures and hearing the incredible life story of Rabinovich in person touched me deeply. We can still hear these testimonies from survivors. We can still now meet these people, shake their hands, and sit with them. They are quiet voices that speak to us. But what they have to say is important, perhaps more important than ever. It is up to us to preserve their words. The Italian writer and Holocaust survivor Primo Levi said it forcefully. Meditate on what has happened. I commend you these words. Carve them into your hearts, at home, on your way, as you lie down, as you get up. Repeat them to your children. When we remember the Holocaust, we do so for the millions of people who did not survive it. But we also do it for the survivors. We do it for us. Only if we understand how something could happen can we prevent such atrocities in the future. The generations born after the war bear no responsibility for the Holocaust. But we do bear the responsibility to remember and to do our utmost to ensure that history does not repeat itself. We have a responsibility to stand up against anti-Semitism, racism, hatred and violence and totalitarianism. The Federal Council speaks out clearly and unequivocally against anti-Semitism and racism. It also adopted a report last June with recommendations on how to further develop measures against anti-Semitism in Switzerland. Remembering the Holocaust is not possible without imparting information and knowledge, especially, but not only, in schools. In recent years, there has been great progress in the field of information technology. This makes it possible to address young people in particular, to get them interested in the history of the Holocaust and the testimonies of the survivors. In addition, the creation of a Swiss memorial for the victims of National Socialism is of great importance to me personally and to the Federal Council as a whole. During the Holocaust, millions of people were murdered: Jews, Sinti and Roma, disabled people, homosexuals. Their dreams and hopes were extinguished in the name of an inhumane ideology which does not tolerate diversity. A diversity that is actually our strength. It is up to us to do everything we can to respect this diversity and defend it at all costs. We must all stand up again and again for those who cannot defend themselves, for a free, democratic world based on the rule of law.
Thank you, President Cassis, for your important message on this occasion. I now invite the President of the Swiss Federation of Jewish Communities, Dr. Ralf Levin, to the stage.
Dear Holocaust survivors, dear President of the National Council, Excellencies, Quod Harav, ladies and gentlemen. Today, 77 years ago, the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp was liberated by the Soviet army. Since Switzerland joined the IHRA in 2004, it too commemorates International Holocaust Remembrance Day. But how many know this date and know what happened on the 27th of January 1945? And above all, how many understand what this date actually stands for in the history of Europe, in the history of the world? Yes, I am sure that we who have been invited here to this festive act and all who are listening to us know about the terrible events, about the reign of terror and the terror of the National Socialists, about the suffering of the victims and the suffering of those born afterwards, as far as this suffering, as far as these fates can be understood. And I am grateful for the many and important activities of the IHRA and for the fact that official Switzerland and so many countries are fulfilling their obligations. But I'm also indebted to the leaders of the numerous organizations, Jewish and non-Jewish, for their tireless efforts against forgetting and for keeping the memory alive. But what about civil society and especially the younger generation? What about the many people who say, enough is enough, let's draw a line? These old stories have nothing to do with me. And I am not to blame, after all. Do they know what we remember every year on 27th of January? This is where we are all challenged in our functions and offices. Here we have the opportunity and even the duty to shape and influence. Because the way we remember determines us in our present and shapes our future. What does that mean? In terms of remembrance policy, a great deal has been done in Switzerland in recent years. We've heard it. For example, the concept for a Swiss memorial for the victims of National Socialism, which we from the Swiss Federation of Jewish Community as a part of a steering group and on the initiative of the Organization of Swiss Abroad, OSA, submitted to the Federal Council in May 2021. Thanks also to remarkably large cross-party parliamentary support, the project is very much on track to be realized under the auspices of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. And we just heard how the president of the Swiss Confederation is also in favor of it, and that very clearly so. It is very welcome that Switzerland has been committed to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism since last year. This has proven its worth and is now recognized and applied by 29 states as well as various cities and organizations. I would also like to remind you of the initiative Stumbling Blocks Switzerland, Stumbling Stones Switzerland, 18 such stumbling stones have already been laid in Switzerland, mainly in Zurich and Basel, and also at the border in Riehen, the stumbling threshold. These small brass plates set into the ground bring to mind the terrible fates of people who were taken away from the supposedly safe Switzerland and murdered in a concentration camp in Europe. Places of remembrance and meditation, be it the stumbling stones or one day an official Swiss memorial, are important. We must join forces when it comes to keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive and, above all, to convey what people are capable of and how it could come to this. I can only repeat that. It was through prejudice, exclusion, discrimination, indescribable hatred, all the way to genocide. But, and this but is written in capital letters, we must not rest on our laurels and think that's all there is to it. No, the debate about the Zurich Kunsthaus and the art collection of former arms manufacturer Emil Georg Bürle is an impressive reminder of the state of the culture of remembrance in Switzerland. We must remember that there is a difference between the past as such and the past as it is remembered. There is also valuable political support for this issue in a motion pending before the Federal Council, which proposes the creation of a national and independent commission for cultural property seized as a result of Nazi persecution. The SIG is strongly committed to this parliamentary initiative, which is modeled on comparable commissions in other countries. The planned memorial, the stumbling stones, to stay with these examples, and the political support that goes with them are such important signs for this country. Another sign will be set today in Zurich when the Grossmünster, the cathedral, the Stadthaus and the synagogue on the Löwenstrasse will be specially illuminated in the evening to mark Remembrance Day, as in numerous other cities around the world. What all these signs and activities have in common is that they initiate a public debate on how Switzerland wants and needs to position itself in questions of remembrance policy. This is indispensable and it is to be welcomed. For those who know and understand the past can better face the challenges of the present. This is also what this day, the 27th January, stands for. That it promotes awareness of civil courage, especially also among the young people, civil courage and a stable democracy and strong human rights. And that it shows us the importance of remembrance for the future. And also that in fighting anti-Semitism. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Levin. I invite Mr. Mark Warszawski to the stage. Mark Warszawski, a cellist and Holocaust survivor, was born in 1933 in Ukraine. He was deported to Kazakhstan in 1941 with his family, where they survived the Holocaust in awful conditions. When the family came back to Ukraine, their old homeland, Mark Warszawski discovered his passion and vocation, the cello. He became a famous artist. He will play Nigun Baal Shem by Ernst Bloch. Thank you, Mr. Warszawski. Greece is this year's chair of the IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which unites governments and experts to strengthen and promote Holocaust education, remembrance, and research worldwide. I invite the Ambassador of Greece, Her Excellency Ekaterini Xagorari, to the podium.
Holocaust survivors, Mrs. President of the National Council, Excellencies, distinguished guests, Greece assumed the presidency of IRA since April 2021 as a result of our deep commitment to fighting anti-Semitism and keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive. The Greek presidency has therefore chosen two crucial topics as its main themes, both highly relevant to the current situation, where we are also battling against the pandemic of fake news. Our main themes are teaching and learning about the Holocaust, education for a world with no more genocide on the one hand, and combating Holocaust denial and distortion on the internet on the other. Greece and the Greek Jews in particular were among the hardest hit during the Second World War. The Holocaust and the appalling loss of life and suffering it entailed still haunt the Greeks' collective memory to this day. So as to never forget that and to never see it repeated, Greece has initiated special educational programs aimed at teaching the younger generations about the Holocaust. These have proven amongst the most successful in Europe, since they view the Holocaust as a warning and a lesson for the present and the future, and not just as a historic fact. Greece was the first European Union state to translate into law the working definitions on anti-Semitism and on Holocaust denial and distortion. We consider education to be one of the most effective tools in the fight against Holocaust denial and distortion, as well as the best defense against the enemies of democracy and freedom. We build on the IRA's engagement to promote and evolve effective Holocaust educational practices, an engagement which has borne great fruit, like most recently the recommendations for teaching and learning about the Holocaust. Education is the most effective weapon in fighting hateful ideologies, thus preserving pluralistic societies and democratic values, as well as the memory of the victims and survivors of the Holocaust for a world with no more genocide. The Greek presidency of the IRA 2021 is devoted to the broadening and deepening of this field by taking initiatives like special discussions among educators, as well as empowering ongoing efforts like the yearly school video competition on the Holocaust, organized by the Greek Ministry of Education and the Jewish Museum of Greece. The Greek presidency also continues IRA's ongoing projects like the enlargement procedure and the initiatives undertaken by the previous German presidency. In this respect, I'm glad to announce that we welcome the Republic of Cyprus and Brazil as new observer countries at the IRA, and North Macedonia as a full member. Yad Vashem, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the Greek Ministry of Education successfully organized a workshop focusing on the IRA recommendations for teaching and learning about the Holocaust. Approximately 170 educators from 4 countries, the United States, Canada, Greece, and Israel, registered for this educational event, which showcased 6 international discussion groups. Under the Greek presidency, a webinar entitled Practical Implementation of the 3 non-legally binding IRA working definitions in multicultural societies, organized also by North Macedonia in collaboration with Austria and Greece. Holocaust survivors, distinguished guests, allow me to say a few words about today's guest of honor, Mrs. Jeanette Hadjis, a Greek Jewish Holocaust survivor and Swiss citizen residing in Geneva. Mrs. Hadjis was born in 1928 in the Greek town of Volos. She was a young girl when her extended family was deported to Auschwitz. Only a cousin returned from the extermination camp. She herself, along with her family, her parents, and her younger sister, were able to flee to the mountains and escape deportation. Her gripping testimony, which we will have the opportunity to watch in a while, has been recorded by the Gamma Ral Foundation, for which I want to express my appreciation to Mrs. Anita Winter. I'm certain that all of you noticed the small exhibition outside the meeting room. I want to thank my Israeli colleagues for their support in coordinating Yad Vashem cooperation and making it possible for us to be able to show you this exceptional collection of photographs of Jewish life in Thessaloniki. Thessaloniki used to be the major center of Jewish Sephardic culture in southeastern Europe, a center of Jewish life in the Balkans and Greece, and a cradle of ideas, art, and innovation. The city saw its 60,000 Jewish citizens perish during the Holocaust when Nazi Germany struck in 1941. Very few survived and made it back to their mother city. Some emigrated to the United States and Israel, and some stayed on to form the basis of the modern Jewish community of Thessaloniki. I'm therefore pleased to welcome today's keynote speaker, Mr. Leon Saltiel, who was born and raised in Thessaloniki and happens to be the World Jewish Congress representative at the United Nations in Geneva and UNESCO, the coordinator on countering anti-Semitism for the World Jewish Congress, and a member of Greece's delegation to the IRA. As a historian, he has published numerous works on the Holocaust. Among them, his recent book, Do Not Forget Me. The book contains some 50 letters sent by 3 Jewish mothers from the ghetto in Thessaloniki to their sons, who were in hiding in Athens during the Second World War. The letters were written during the period of deportations in Thessaloniki and until the departure of the 3 mothers for Auschwitz. We all feel really honored that Leon's book has won the 2021 Yad Vashem International Book Prize for Holocaust Research. In 2020, the book was made into a documentary and produced in the framework of the annual Dimitria Festival, the leading cultural institution organized by the city of Thessaloniki. The documentary features a dramatic reading of the letters, including some by the President of the Hellenic Republic. It is in our plans to present the documentary in Bern, if the COVID situation allows us, hopefully before the end of our IRA presidency. Distinguished guests, for Greece, the Holocaust experience is both a warning and a lesson for the present and the future. Education about the Holocaust is not only a moral duty towards victims and survivors, but also a sound path to solidify critical thinking, to forge responsible political attitudes, and protect human rights and democracy in each individual country and the world as a whole. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Xagorari. As introduced by Ambassador Xagorari, please join us in watching the video testimony by Ms. Jeanette Hadis, a Greek Holocaust survivor living in Switzerland.
Je n'oublie jamais que ce sont les Grecs qui nous ont sauvé la vie à mon père, ma mère, ma sœur et moi. Et je les remercie de tout mon cœur. Je suis fière d'être grec, fière d'être suisse et fière d'être juif. J'ai un amalgame, le meilleur du monde. Je m'appelle Jeannette Hadis Bokhoropoulou. Ou Bokhoropoulou Hadis, je ne sais pas lequel je dois mettre le premier. Moi, je vis avec cette photo. C'est la famille de mon père. Son papa, 6 frères, une sœur, tous avec leurs enfants dans cette photo-là. Chaque fois que je vois cette photo, je me demande Hachem, qui je suis, moi, que tu m'as sauvé? Tu as sauvé ma mère, mon père et ma petite sœur. Je ne peux pas comprendre. C'est pour ça que je vis avec cette photo-là. Parce que cette photo, c'est moi, c'est mon enfance, c'est ma famille. Seulement celle-ci, une petite cousine à moi, fille de grand frère de mon papa, c'est quelque chose d'inimaginable. Elle est revenue d'Auschwitz, elle frappe à la porte, elle a demandé « Est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un de ma famille qui est sauvé ?» Ils ont dit « C'est oncle Isaac ». Alors, il frappe à la porte, papa va ouvrir et il voit Rachel. « mon enfant, où sont les autres ?» Il n'y a pas d'autres. Pas pour les mamans, il lui dit, peut-être qu'ils vont venir plus tard. Et papa, je ne l'ai pas vu, mais peut-être il est avec les autres. Ça. Alors, chaque soir, on dormait ensemble, chacune à son lit. Et on parlait de tout, mais elle ne parlait jamais de la Shoah. Un soir, mais chaque soir, elle sortait un morceau de savon, elle le mettait sur la table de nuit et elle dormait. Et ça sentait mauvais. Une fois, deux fois, trois fois, quelques semaines ont passé. Alors un soir, je lui ai dit, écoute, si tu ne me dis pas le mystère de ce savon, je ne te laisse pas dormir toute la nuit. Alors, elle a commencé à pleurer et elle m'a dit peut-être que ce morceau de savon, c'est le corps de ma maman et de mon papa. Alors moi, quand j'ai entendu ça, je ne pouvais pas imaginer, moi, toutes ces atrocités-là. Alors j'appelle mes parents et ils ont commencé de la prendre dans les bras et ils croyaient qu'elle est folle. Alors elle nous a raconté toutes les atrocités. Mais je me rappelle toujours cette soirée parce que c'était tellement touchante. On était tous toute la nuit comme ça dans les bras, on pleurait. Et jusqu'à ce moment-là, on avait toujours l'espoir que quelqu'un va venir ou tous ou plusieurs. Mais malheureusement, elle nous a dit qu'il n'y avait aucun espoir. Et on a commencé à pleurer et on a commencé le deuil que malheureusement, ça ne finit jamais. C'était une époque horrible, horrible. Je ne sais pas comment on a survécu. Et je me rappelle qu'un soir, on a entendu la porte frapper très fort. Papa ouvre, quelqu'un l'a mis comme ça. Ils sont entrés dans la maison et ils ont dit « On aime votre maison et on voudrait quelques chambres ». Ils ont pris toutes les chambres d'amis, ma chambre et la chambre de ma sœur. Et le traducteur a dit, écoutez, vous prenez vos filles dans votre chambre. On dirait qu'on avait besoin de conseils, enfin. Alors, un jour, il y avait seulement un Allemand et il était couché et la porte était ouverte. Alors, ma petite sœur passe de là-bas et elle le voit de manger le chocolat, chose inimaginable à ce temps-là. Maman, elle a commencé à pleurer, je veux du chocolat. Alors, maman va vers vers l'allemand et il lui a fait comprendre pour lui donner un peu de chocolat à la petite qu'elle pleurait. Lui, il s'est levé, on croyait qu'il va lui donner et il a donné malheureusement un coup de pied horrible à ma mère qu'elle s'est jetée dans l'autre côté de la chambre. Ma petite sœur, elle était sur maman, elle pleurait, maman, elle ne bougeait pas. Et moi, j'étais devant lui, glacée, tremblant, et j'entendais mes dents claquer. Comme ça, j'avais peur parce que lui, il mangeait le chocolat, il projetait le pistolet, l'arme vers moi. Et moi, je tremblais tout entière, mais je ne pouvais pas bouger pour aller vers maman, vers ma sœur. À un moment donné, j'ai trouvé la force, toute tremblante, et je vais vers maman. Et maman a mis sa main sur ma tête. Là, j'ai compris qu'elle était vivante. Maman, ma petite maman, tu es vivante, et j'ai perdu connaissance. Je ne sais pas combien de temps. Maman, elle me caressait la tête et je me suis réveillée parce que ma sœur pleurait beaucoup, très fort. Elle nous a dit, maman, faites attention les enfants, quand papa va venir, il ne faut pas lui raconter ça. Parce que peut-être il va dire quelque chose à l'allemand, il va nous le tuer. Je vais lui dire moi plus tard, mais pas vous, vous allez rien dire. Oui, maman. Et comme ça, c'était un miracle après, comme le jour de la Shoah, il n'y avait pas des Allemands à la maison. Ils sont partis tôt le matin, ou plutôt un jour avant, pour aller faire la guerre aux partisans. Je me rappelle comment on est parti de la maison pour aller à la montagne avec les partisans. Ce sont les Grecs, les amis grecs et les voisinages qui sont venus. Ils nous ont dit qu'il n'y a plus de Juifs à Yanina. Il faut partir et aller à la montagne. Aller où? Non, il faut bien vous habiller. Vous prenez rien du tout avec vous et vous partez. On va vous indiquer où. Et alors, on part. Et puis, il neigeait pour la première fois. Et il fallait traverser une grande plaine. Alors, on marche dans la boue jusqu'à là. Et on arrive dans un endroit qu'il y avait deux chemins, à droite et à gauche. Et papa, il s'arrête, il dit maintenant, on va où? On va à gauche ou à droite? Et à ce moment-là, il y a un jeune homme avec des yeux bleus et des cheveux blonds qui se trouve devant nous et sans rien lui dire, il nous a dit, allez à droite. Et papa a dit, Beshem Hashem, au nom du Seigneur, on va aller à droite. Et en marchant, on a tourné la tête pour le voir, mais il n'y avait rien. Il n'y avait personne et c'était une plaine qu'il n'y avait même pas un arbre. Et papa a dit, c'était un ange qui est venu vers nous. On va à droite. On entre dans le village et on voit une jeune femme qui vient avec les bras ouverts comme ça. Et c'était la fille d'un ami de papa. Alors il a dit, autant qu'il y a la guerre, vous serez chez nous. Elle nous a pris à la maison, elle et son mari. Et ils ont commencé à nous mettre des draps, des choses, des matelas pour dormir et tout ça. Vous allez rester ici. On a dormi. Vers 5 heures du matin, la porte qui sonne, qui tape comme ça. Et papa a dit, maintenant c'est fini. Ce sont les Allemands qui sont venus nous chercher. Ils ouvrent la porte et il y avait des villageois avec des chevaux. Ouais. Alors, on se met sur les chevaux, sous la pluie, et on va à un village qui s'appelle Tseritsena. Ce village, c'était notre sauveur. On est resté là-bas 8 mois longs. Si je suis vivante, si mes parents étaient vivants et ma sœur aussi, c'était grâce aux Grecs. Ils étaient extraordinaires avec nous et on n'oublie jamais. Alors, un jour, ils ont capturé un Allemand. Alors, il était très jeune et ils l'ont attaché sous le soleil du mois d'août et ça dégoulinait de partout, la transpiration et tout ça, et ça se voyait comment il était malheureux. Et maman, elle a eu pitié de lui parce qu'il était très jeune. Alors, il lui a donné de l'eau fraîche, de la fontaine et des raisins. Et lui, il a dit pas merci, bien sûr, parce que c'est un Allemand. Alors, il a commencé à boire et à manger, à boire et à manger. Et sur ce grand plaisir qu'il avait, maman lui dit, moi je suis juive. Quand il a entendu ça, il a pris l'eau et les raisins, les a jetés. Grâce à Dieu, je suis ici. Et je ne sais pas combien encore. Mais je voulais dire à tout le monde que je vous aime, que je vous bénisse et que le bon Dieu fasse un grand miracle, nous donner la paix au monde entier. Parce que tout le monde est enfant de même Père céleste.
Thank you, Ms. Khadis, for your moving testimony. I invite Mr. Mark Warszawski to the stage. He will play Kaddish by Maurice Ravel. Thank you, Mr. Warshawski, for your moving piece. I now introduce to you our last speaker of this evening, Dr. Leon Saltiel. He is an historian, a representative at the World Jewish Congress, a member of the Greek delegation to IRA, and an author of the book, The Holocaust in Thessaloniki.
Dear survivors, President of the National Council, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I'm honored to stand before you today to speak about the history of the Jewish community of Thessaloniki, a community where I was born in and belong to, and where my family is still an active part of. I wish to thank the Embassy of Greece, as President of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and the Embassy of Israel for organizing this event in the framework of the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, as well as the government of Switzerland, the Jewish community and institutions, and all the other IRA members for their support. For more than 20 centuries, Thessaloniki, or Salonika, or Saloniki, has been home to a vibrant Jewish community. The first Jews may have arrived from Alexandria around 140 BCE. The ancient Jewish community of Thessaloniki constituted a typical example of a Judaic community in a Mediterranean urban setting of the Hellenistic and Roman eras. It was in the city synagogue that Apostle Paul came to preach the new religion, known as the Letters to Thessalonians. Following the Spanish Inquisition in 1492, thousands of fleeing Jews found shelter in Thessaloniki, creating a large and flourishing Jewish community, one of the most prominent in the world. These Jews were called Sephardim and kept to our days the old Castilian idiom which they were speaking, known as Ladino or Judo-Spanish. The Jews were very prominent in all spheres of public, social, and economic life, and through the European networks, they were the agents of innovation, of new ideas, and economic prosperity. A major center of Jewish learning, Thessaloniki was running according to the Jewish calendar, with everything closed on the Sabbath. No wonder why some of its names include Jerusalem of the Balkans and Mother of Israel. When the Greek army entered the city in 1912, and since then the city is part of Greece, the Jewish community constituted the majority of the inhabitants, some 80,000 people out of a population of 150,000, a reality that marked the basic character of the city. This means that Thessaloniki was most probably the only major city in Europe with a Jewish majority. This long and illustrious history came to an abrupt end with the deportations and murder of the vast majority of the community in the Auschwitz death camp, more than 90% of some 50,000 Jews. In less than 4 months, in 1943, the Jewish population of the city was transported in cattle cars, some 80 people in one wagon, without any distinction between the children, the sick, the elderly, or pregnant women. Most went directly to the gas chambers upon arrival. Today we honor their memory and all of the 6 million European Jews, victims of hatred and anti-Semitism, who were murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators, as well as the rescuers who helped the persecuted Jews, risking their own lives. This is how a Jewish mother in Thessaloniki, Sarina Saltiel, herself a victim of the Holocaust, described what was happening during the deportations in a letter to her son, who was living in Athens. The first convoy has already left. We don't know where to. The second one will leave today. On the day of departure, people go crazy. They burn their paper money, destroy their furniture with the cries of mortally wounded animals. Then, after abandoning all the fruits of their labor, they leave packed like sardines and treated worse than animals in cattle wagons. The few survivors that returned, either from the camps or from hiding, or from fighting with the resistance, found hardly any family members. Their homes were robbed, the synagogues destroyed, and their ancient cemetery completely dug up. They had the difficult task to reconstruct the community and Jewish life. Today, the city continues to be home of a proud and active Jewish community, which maintains 3 synagogues, a Jewish school, an elderly home, a summer camp, a museum, and holds several cultural events throughout the year. A Holocaust museum is currently being planned in the city, with the support of the Greek government and other governments and institutions around the world, to preserve the memory of the victims and educate the future generations. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saltiel. We will now conclude the commemoration ceremony with a prayer in remembrance of the Holocaust victims. Kaddish, read by Rabbi Michael Cohn.
Please, we should stand for Kaddish. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה חירותי והמליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מרך לעולם ולעלמי עלמיה, יתפרח וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל, שמי די קודשה בריחו, לעילה מכל ברכתה ושירתה, תוש ברכתה ונחמתה, דאמירן בעלמה, ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן.
Thank you all for your participation in this year's International Holocaust Remembrance Ceremony. Toda Rabba and Shalom. Thank you very much. Okay.